the Massachusetts House has agreed to go in overtime with a formal legislative session, and the Senate is also weighing continuing meetings beyond the original end date, which was supposed to be tomorrow, to work on a slew of important legislation. On the list, a police reform bill. Boston is looking into the issue as well, with a task force that's been holding public listening sessions on police policies and practices, and will submit initial reform recommendations to the mayor by August 14th. Among those on the task force is Tanisha Sullivan, who you may know as the president of Boston's NAACP, and in that role she's been plenty busy as well, working on the 111th annual NAACP Convention, which was supposed to be held in Boston this summer, but like everything else has shifted to a virtual program. Certainly won't be the same as an in-person experience, but there's some benefits to going online. They've expanded programming to include Free Arts Festival, which starts tomorrow night with a drive-in concert and continues virtually next week, tracing the path of African-American achievement through film, TV, music, literature, and the performing arts. Tanisha Sullivan recently joined me. Tanisha, it's good to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
It's always good to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. Can we go back to the beginning just for a second? Boston has a pretty sorry history on race. And it was as recently as 2017, the Globe did that series. And one of the most dramatic pieces for me was that survey of African Americans across the country, asking them to rate how unwelcoming 8 American cities were. We were the least welcoming of the 8. In that context, why did the National NAACP decide that they would welcome Boston as their hosts for this convention?
I think it's more like, why would the NAACP give Boston a shot? And I think
why?
For our association, there are a few things that we look for when we're identifying a location to host a convention. One is certainly the willingness of the city to host the convention, and certainly the city of Boston and the Commonwealth were both very welcoming. The other is when a national convention comes to a city, it really does shine a light on what's happening there, good, bad, or indifferent. And so I think with this convention, there was an opportunity, and still is an opportunity, for people across the country to get a sense of what Boston is like in 2020. And I think it is important to note there has been progress here in the city. That being said, it would have also given folks an opportunity to see that for as far as we've come, we still have a lot more work to do. The Globe Spotlight series you referenced, the Color of Wealth study done by the Boston Fed in 2015, we issued a report, as you know, in 2017 as well. The deep economic inequality that exists here in the city of Boston is something that we cannot hide from. And that surely would have been front and center. That being said, it still is, because of where we are, with respect to COVID-19 and the racial protesting that's happening.
By the way, the study you're referencing is the statistic that almost everybody has memorized. The average wealth of a white family in this community, $247,000. The average wealth of an African-American family, $8. I want to get back to that bright light you talked about a minute ago, Tanisha. Obviously, it can't be quite as bright when it's virtual, but will it exist at all through a virtual convention? Will there be a light on our city?
Yes, of course there'll be a light on our city. We are, although we're not hosting the convention in person, there's still a lot of interest in the city of Boston and what's happening here. We are fortunate to live in one of the parts of the country where, prior to COVID-19, hopefully after COVID-19 as well, we've experienced significant economic prosperity. We're also, noted as, having one of the strongest public education systems in the country. We are seen as, a part of the country where there are deep progressive values. And yet, we are also seen as one of the parts of the country where we have very deep-seated, deep-rooted systemic racism that still exists. And so you cannot have an NAACP convention and not have a spotlight on that. The question is, what are we going to do about it? That has always been the question. I think that going into this convention cycle, we are certainly looking for opportunities Given the timing, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we do want to give an opportunity to highlight some of the good things that are happening here, the great people who are here, the culture that's here. At the same time, we will also, as we move through this convention cycle, take the opportunity to have some deep conversations and to talk about where we are and where we need to be. And, for us in Boston, I think one of the things people might say is, systemic racism exists everywhere. Why are people so focused here in Boston? My response to that has consistently been that the bar is higher for us. Sometimes we set it for ourselves, but in many respects, people look to Boston and they see great things happening. And so it really makes them scratch their heads and wonder how it is that we can have contracting here in the city of Boston, for example, where, Black and brown businesses are struggling to get 2%, let alone 30% of contracts. People look at our public education system, as I noted, one of the best in the country. But when you look at the deep racial opportunity gaps that exist, it makes people question why. So there's much for us to talk about, but there's also a lot for us to learn from what's happening in other parts of the country as it relates to racial justice and racial equality.
I want to pick up on something you said for our final minute. You talked about systemic racism all over the country, and I mentioned you're one of the people sitting on the mayor's task force on police reform here. I want to play for you an exchange between Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee and the Attorney General of the United States and get your reaction. Here is Congresswoman Jackson Lee and Attorney General Barr.
Does the Trump Justice Department seek to end systemic racism and racism in law enforcement? I just need a yes or no answer.
To the extent there is racism in any of our institutions in this country and the police, then obviously this administration will fully enforce.
You agree that there may be systemic racism?
To the extent, in where?
Let me continue my line of questioning.
I don't agree that there's systemic racism in the police department.
Specifically,
generally in this country.
What's your reaction to that last sentence, Tanisha?
Look, we cannot possibly achieve all that our Constitution promises, all that our values are supposed to espouse, unless and until we have a society that acknowledges and understands that there are people, specifically people of color, Black and brown people, indigenous people, who are experiencing systemic racism. If we do not acknowledge that there's a problem, there's no way for us to work together to solve it. And so it is deeply troubling. It has been deeply troubling that this administration has just not been able to acknowledge that structural racism is a thing, that systemic racism is real, because it really does keep us from being the country that we can be. That being said, we can talk all day about the failures of our federal government, but I think it's critically important for us here in the Commonwealth to focus on what's happening in the Commonwealth and to focus on what's happening in our own backyards. Because while we can point our fingers towards what's not happening at the federal level, in the ineptitude at the federal level, we've got major issues here. The fact that our state legislature is finding it so difficult to pass policing reform legislation after thousands of people have taken to the streets, not just in our cities, but in our towns across the Commonwealth, when there have been thousands of proclamations that Black Lives Matter, that our state legislature still can't seem to get the job done when it comes to policing reform, means that we have many issues that we need to address here in the Commonwealth as it relates to systemic racism.
Tanisha Sullivan, it's good to see you. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You can register for tomorrow night's drive-in soul music concert at the Bayside Expo Plaza, which will also be live streamed at NAACPBoston.com. That's also where you can find more information on the Visual Arts, Culture, and Entertainment Festival that starts Monday, as well as the virtual convention, which is September 13th through the 26th. I should note as well, WGBH and the Boston Globe are teaming up with the NAACP Boston for a series of discussions on race and the pandemic. You can find the first installment online at the address on your screen. The next one will be September 23rd. I also spoke with Tanisha a bit further about the police reform efforts when she joined us on Boston Public Radio this week, and she said something there that I think is worth sharing again.
I think what happens on Beacon Hill is really going to be a defining moment for our Commonwealth, and I don't say that lightly. I don't want to sound cliche-ish. I truly do believe it. If we cannot get on the books laws that are meant to protect the humanity of all people, and laws that recognize that Black people, even here in the Commonwealth, are subjected to systemic and structural racism, and put laws on the books that are meant to combat that, then I don't know what we're doing.
And neither do I.